Hi guys, today we have a video about a very dark era for the stock market, the banks, and the people. The Great Depression. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get to it.
Maybe your grandfather mentioned it once. At the dinner table, a Sunday afternoon, some moment when the conversation went quiet, and he said something like, "We didn't have much back then." And then he stopped. Changed the subject. Moved on. A lot of them did that. The ones who lived through it rarely talked about it in full. Not because they forgot, because they didn't. Because some things settle into a person so deeply that putting them into words feels like reopening something that finally, after decades, had closed. This is the story of what they lived through, and it starts on an ordinary morning. Cold. Still dark when the first people arrived. A line already forming on the sidewalk outside a building in the middle of an American city. It could be Chicago. It could be Detroit. It could be the town you grew up in. The line stretches past the old barbershop, past the corner where the newsstand used to be, and disappears around the block. Nobody knows exactly how long it is. Nobody looks back to check. A man near the front has his hands deep in his coat pockets. He's been a machinist for 11 years. Skilled work. Steady work. The kind of work you build a life around. His hands are used to doing things. Gripping, shaping, making. Standing still with them feels wrong. Like a word you keep mispronouncing. Over and over. Knowing it's wrong and not knowing how to fix it. He keeps his eyes forward. Behind him, a younger man in a jacket, slightly too thin for the weather, stares at his shoes. Good shoes. You can still see faint traces of the last polish. Weeks ago now, before everything changed. He hasn't made eye contact with anyone since he got here. There's a particular kind of shame in standing in this line, even when everyone you know is standing in some version of the same line. Knowing that doesn't help. It never does. The line moves a few inches. No one speaks. Somewhere above them, a window opens briefly, then closes again. This is America. The year is 1932. And what brought these men here? What brought millions of Americans to lines exactly like this one, in cities and towns across the entire country, is a story that began years earlier, in a time that felt, to almost everyone living through it, like the beginning of something great. It wasn't, but nobody knew that yet. There's something about the 1920s that's almost hard to believe now. Not because of the parties or the jazz or the stories you've probably heard. It's more about the feeling underneath all of that. The sense that things were genuinely, unmistakably improving. That the engine of the country had found a rhythm, and that rhythm wasn't going to stop. It had been building for a while. The war had ended. The big one. The one that was supposed to end all wars. And the men had come home, and the country had exhaled. Factories that had been producing shells and uniforms and supplies shifted back to making things people actually wanted. Cars. Refrigerators. Radios. Things that made daily life feel different, feel modern, feel like the future was not a distant concept, but something you could put in your living room. And people were buying, not just because they had money, though many of them did, at least compared to before, but because the whole culture had shifted toward the idea of wanting things and getting them. Credit was new in a widespread way. Installment plans. You could buy a washing machine and pay it off over months, a little at a time. It seemed almost magical to people who'd grown up thinking you only owned what you could afford outright on the day you handed over the cash. Cities were growing. Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, New York. Streets that had been quiet a generation earlier were now full of movement, full of noise, full of people who'd come from somewhere else, from rural farmland, from southern states, from Europe, from places where opportunity had run dry, and were trying to make something new in these dense, improbable cities. The radio changed everything in a way that's hard to explain to someone who grew up with the internet. Before it, your world was essentially local. What happened 2 towns over might reach you days later, filtered through a newspaper that might not cover it well. But the radio brought voices directly into your home, in real time, and suddenly the country felt smaller and more connected than it ever had. People gathered around the set in the evenings, listened to music, listened to news, listened to comedians and drama programs and baseball games being described, play by play, the crack of a bat made real by a stranger's voice coming through a cloth speaker in a wooden box. It was a particular kind of American optimism, that era. Not naive exactly. People knew bad things happened. They'd lived through the war. Many of them had lost someone. But there was a collective feeling, hard to name but easy to recognize in the photographs, in the advertisements, in the sheer amount of construction happening everywhere, that the worst was behind them, that things were on their way up. And then there was the stock market. In the mid-1920s, the stock market started doing something it had never really done before on such a wide scale. It started attracting ordinary people, not just wealthy investors, teachers, barbers, farmers who'd scraped together a little extra cash. The idea was simple enough and seductive enough to spread quickly. You put money in, the market goes up, you get more money out. And the market was going up. Every year, it seemed, the numbers climbed higher. What fed the excitement was also what made it dangerous, though almost no one understood that at the time. People were buying stocks on something called margin. Essentially, you could borrow money to buy more shares than you could actually afford, betting that the price would rise enough to cover the loan and still leave you a profit. In a rising market, this worked. It worked brilliantly. You could put in $10, borrow 90 more, buy $100 worth of stock, watch it rise to 140, sell it, pay back the 90 you borrowed, and walk away with 50 you didn't have before. People told each other stories like this, at dinner tables, at barber shops, standing in line at the bank. Stories of men who'd turned small savings into serious money in a matter of months. And those stories were true, at least some of them, which made them all the more powerful. The phrase you heard a lot was that stocks could only go up, that the American economy was so fundamentally strong, so structurally sound, that the market was really just reflecting an ongoing reality. This country was growing, and anyone smart enough to put their money in was going to grow with it. This was 1927. Then 1928. And here is where something important happened. Not in the markets, but in the minds of ordinary people. The line between investing and gambling had blurred so completely that most people couldn't see it anymore. What felt like wisdom was actually exposure. What felt like confidence was actually a cliff edge, dressed up in the language of progress. By the summer of 1929, the numbers on the exchange were so high that they seemed almost abstract. Serious economists and investors, not all of them but some, were quietly starting to get nervous. The prices didn't entirely make sense anymore when you looked at what the companies were actually worth, what they were actually earning. But nervousness is quiet, excitement is loud, and the excitement in the summer of 1929 was very loud. October comes the way it always does in New York, gradually, then all at once. The heat of September gives way to cooler mornings, and the city shifts its wardrobe, its tempo, its morning light. By mid-October 1929, the air downtown had that particular autumn quality, clear, slightly sharp, smelling faintly of leaves and exhaust from the cars that now crowded the financial district streets. The market had been wobbling since early October. Small drops, small recoveries. The kind of motion that didn't alarm most people. Markets fluctuate. That's what they do. The fundamentals were strong. Everyone knew the fundamentals were strong. Thursday, October 24th started like other days. By mid-morning, it had become something else entirely. Sell orders were coming in faster than the exchange could process them.
Prices were falling. Not wobbling now, but falling. Dropping in ways that triggered more selling, which triggered more falling. The ticker tape fell hours behind. Brokers on the floor were shouting into telephones. People who'd bought on margin were getting calls demanding they put up more money immediately, or their positions would be sold out from under them. Many of them didn't have it. Crowds formed outside the exchange. Not violent, mostly just people standing there watching, trying to understand what they were hearing from inside. A group of bankers met that afternoon and pooled resources to buy stocks, a signal meant to show confidence, meant to slow the bleeding. For a day or two it seemed to work. The market steadied slightly, then it didn't. The following Tuesday, October 29th, a date that would eventually become one of the most remembered in American financial history, the selling resumed with a ferocity that made the previous Thursday look modest. Over 16 million shares changed hands that day, a number that the infrastructure of the exchange could barely manage, that left the ticker tape running hours late into the evening, that left brokers exhausted and sometimes physically shaking. By the close of trading, staggering amounts of money had simply vanished, not transferred, not moved somewhere else. Just gone. Paper wealth that had existed in ledgers and margin accounts and brokerage statements that morning no longer existed by afternoon. There is a particular silence that follows a financial catastrophe. Not the silence of death exactly, more like the silence of a room after someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. People stood on the sidewalks outside the exchange that evening and didn't quite know how to walk home. Some of them had lost everything. Some had lost more than everything. And all of them were trying to understand how a Tuesday afternoon could feel so different from a Tuesday morning. For people who'd borrowed to invest, the situation was immediate and catastrophic. For those who'd used their savings, it was devastating but at least survivable in the immediate term. For the wealthiest investors, it was a shock, but not necessarily a ruin. But for the American economy as a whole, the real effects were only just beginning to ripple outward, slowly at first, then faster than anyone expected. Most people didn't feel it right away. That's worth saying clearly because the image of overnight chaos is a bit misleading. The crash happened over days and weeks. Its effects spread over months. And even then, for most Americans living ordinary lives in ordinary towns, the connection between what happened on Wall Street and what happened to their own lives wasn't immediately obvious. A farmer in Kansas hadn't invested in the market. He had his land, his livestock, his yearly cycle of planting and waiting and harvesting. The crash, when he heard about it on the radio, seemed like something that happened to other kinds of people in other kinds of places. A schoolteacher in Ohio had her salary. She paid her bills. She had a small savings account at the local bank. She knew the market had fallen, but she hadn't put money in it, so she turned off the radio and went to bed. A factory worker in Michigan had his job at the plant. He made cars. People bought cars. Cars were important. He was fine. For a few months this was accurate. Life continued. Not unchanged. There was an uncertainty in the air that hadn't been there before, a slight dampening of the optimism that had been so pervasive. But for most people, the daily routine held. Then, slowly, things began to shift. What's strange about this kind of collapse is that nobody announced it. There was no moment where the country gathered and said, "Things are bad now." It arrived the way a season changes, barely noticeable at first, then undeniable. A smaller paycheck, a closed store, a friend who moved away. Each thing small enough to explain away on its own. Together, they added up to something that couldn't be explained away at all. The factory orders slowed first. Less demand meant less production, meant shorter hours. The factory worker in Michigan didn't lose his job, not immediately, but his check came back smaller. He cut back on things he didn't need. Most people like him did the same, and when millions of people cut back on what they spend, the businesses they'd been spending at begin to feel it. The farmer's situation was more complicated and in some ways more fragile. Agricultural prices had already been suffering through the 1920s, even while the rest of the economy boomed. Now, with less money circulating, with banks tightening lending, with the whole economic machine beginning to seize up, the prices for grain and cotton and hogs dropped further, sometimes below what it cost to grow them. The farmer found himself in the bewildering position of working through a full season, only to sell his crop at a loss. And the banks. The banks were perhaps the most critical link in the chain, and the weakest one. First were there were thousands of banks in America at that time. Not the consolidated giants of today, but small local banks, town banks, community savings institutions that held the deposits of everyday people and lent that money out to farmers and small businesses and homeowners. Many of these banks had done what seemed prudent in the boom years, lent money, collected interest, grown their portfolios. But a significant number of them had lent money to people who were now struggling to pay it back, had invested in securities that were now worth far less than the purchase price, had made themselves vulnerable to exactly the kind of cascading loss that the crash had set in motion. Rumors started. Small towns are not anonymous places. When word got around that a particular bank was in trouble, people began to worry about their deposits. Were they safe? Would the money be there if they needed it? There was no federal deposit insurance then. If a bank failed, you lost what you had in it, all of it. So people started showing up at banks to take their money out, which was, from each individual's perspective, a completely rational thing to do. But when enough people do it at once, it's called a bank run, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. A bank that might have survived can't survive when hundreds of depositors are all demanding their cash simultaneously. It doesn't have that much cash on hand. No bank does. Banks operate on the assumption that not everyone will want everything at once. When they did, banks closed, some temporarily, some permanently. And when a bank closed, every business that depended on it for credit stopped being able to function. Every family that had deposits there faced a sudden, complete loss of their savings. In 1930, over 1,300 banks failed in the United States. In 1931, more than 2,000. Think about what that means in human terms. Families who had spent years building up modest savings, money set aside for a child's education, or for buying land, or for the security of having something in reserve, waking up one morning to find that it was simply gone. Not stolen, not lost through any mistake of their own. Gone because of a system that had failed around them. Some of those people never trusted a bank again, not out of stubbornness, out of experience. They kept money in coffee cans, in coat pockets, under mattresses, places that seemed irrational to people who hadn't lived through it, places that made complete sense to people who had. By 1931, the mood of the country had changed in ways that are difficult to describe fully in statistics, though the statistics are grim enough. Unemployment, which had been hovering around 3% before the crash, had climbed past 16%. It would eventually reach 25%. 1 in 4 American workers without a job. Not voluntarily, not by choice, simply because the jobs weren't there. And those numbers don't capture the people who had jobs but were working part-time, who had reduced hours and reduced wages, who were technically employed but bringing home a fraction of what they had before. The whole country had quietly, collectively, dramatically reduced its standard of living, and most people were still trying to understand what had happened. But here is what the numbers don't tell you at all, what it felt like to be one of them, to be the person those numbers described.
To get up every morning and face a day that had no clear shape, no reliable trajectory. That particular emptiness, not dramatic, just persistent, was the real texture of the Depression for millions of Americans. There's a phrase that got used a lot in those years. In letters and diaries and newspaper columns, people described what was happening as though it were a natural disaster, a drought that had spread from the economy outward, a frost that had settled over everything. They reached for weather metaphors because weather was something everyone understood, something that came from outside, something no one was to blame for and no one could fully predict. In a way, this comparison was comforting, and in another way, it was one of the cruelest parts of the whole situation, because unlike a drought, the Depression didn't end with rain. It deepened. Imagine a Tuesday morning in a mid-size American city. The year is 1932. A woman gets up before her family. The apartment is cold because coal costs money, and money is carefully rationed now. She puts on the water for coffee. Though the coffee is weak, you stretch what you have. She counts the eggs in the icebox. 4. The bread is from 2 days ago. but still good if you don't think about it too hard. Her husband was laid off 7 months ago. He worked at a printing company that had done well through the 1920s, that had printed catalogs and promotional materials for businesses flush with advertising budgets. The advertising budgets had been among the first things cut when companies started pulling back. The printing company had held on for a while, tried to manage with fewer orders, and then one afternoon, the owner had called the employees together and told them quietly that he was closing the doors. He'd cried a little. So had some of the men. Her husband has been looking for work since then. Not casually. He gets up every morning, puts on his good shirt, the one saved for this, and goes out. He reads the newspaper job listings at the public library because they can no longer afford a daily subscription. He follows leads. He applies at places he knows aren't hiring because maybe something has changed since last week. He comes home in the afternoon and sits at the kitchen table for a while before talking. She doesn't ask how it went. She can tell. What they do have is each other, and this matters more than it might have before. The depression, for all the ways it damaged families, also in some cases created an intensity of closeness among people who had no choice but to rely on each other. Extended families moved back together under one roof. Neighbors shared food and took turns watching children. Communities that had been relatively anonymous grew more intimate, not always comfortably, but genuinely. Her neighbor 2 floors down, Mrs. Kowalski, has a garden in a vacant lot nearby. Not officially, but no one complains because no one owns the lot for any productive purpose anymore. Mrs. Kowalski grows tomatoes and beans and something green that she calls by a Polish name that no one else knows. In the late summer, she gives away more than she keeps. She doesn't say anything about it. She just leaves things by doors. These were the textures of daily life. The bread lines and soup kitchens had become a common feature of American cities by 1931, 1932. They were run by private charities, by churches, by organizations that had existed before, but had never been stretched this thin. The Red Cross, the Salvation Army. Local community organizations whose members were often nearly as financially precarious as the people they were serving. The lines were long, sometimes hundreds of people waiting for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. The food was simple. Sometimes it was very good. There were people who found the soup kitchens genuinely nourishing. And sometimes it was whatever could be obtained cheaply and in bulk, which meant a watery broth with little solid content and bread that was at the end of its edible life. What struck observers at the time, journalists who wrote about it, social workers who were there every day, photographers who began documenting it, was the silence, the quietness of these lines. These were not angry crowds. They were not protesters. They were people waiting, with a kind of exhausted patience, for something to eat. Men who had been electricians and salesmen and truck drivers, women who had been office workers and homemakers and store clerks, old men, young men, men who might have been mistaken for business professionals a year earlier, in better coats. The silence had a particular quality. It wasn't defeat exactly. It was more like suspension, like everyone had agreed, without discussing it, to hold a certain set of emotions at a distance for now, to get through the day first, and to feel things later when there was more room for it. Photographers from this era, Dorothea Lange's is perhaps the most famous, but there were others, captured something in these faces that resists simple description. There's a quality in those portraits that goes beyond sadness or hardship. It's something more like endurance. The specific expression of a person who has absorbed something enormous and is still standing. Those photographs became some of the defining images of American history. They were part of a broader effort by the federal government to document what was happening, an effort that was itself remarkable. The government sending artists and writers and photographers across the country to record the experience of ordinary Americans living through something extraordinary. The results form one of the most complete portraits we have of daily American life in any era. The work of charity in those years was immense and largely invisible. By invisible, not hidden exactly, the breadlines were as visible as anything in a city, but unacknowledged in the sense that the people doing the work rarely talked about it in terms of heroism or sacrifice. They just did it, the way people do when circumstances make an activity obviously necessary and there's no one else around to do it. The women who ran the soup kitchens often came from churches or women's clubs or neighborhood organizations that had existed for years, doing smaller things, managing smaller needs. The Depression simply scaled those needs beyond anything they'd anticipated. They made do, they stretched budgets. They found suppliers willing to donate near-expired goods. They learned to cook for 500 when the room held 800 and adjusted in whatever ways they could. There were dignity rules in some of these places, though no one called them that. Rules that said you couldn't turn people away if they showed up late. Rules that said you served everyone the same thing, regardless of who they were or how they arrived. Rules that meant no one had to explain themselves or prove their need or undergo the particular humiliation of being assessed and found deserving. You came. You were fed. That was all there was to it. Some of the kitchen workers knew many of the people they served. In a mid-sized city, in a neighborhood that had contracted inward on itself, you might recognize someone from church, or the woman whose children had gone to school with yours, or a man who had fixed your brother-in-law's car. These recognitions were managed quietly, with a kind of mutual tact. You didn't remark on seeing them there. You handed them their bowl. You moved to the next person. Later, some of those people would become very private about having stood in those lines. It would be, for them, a piece of the past they carried carefully, sharing it only when it felt necessary, or when someone younger seemed to need to hear it. The small businesses that died during the Depression are harder to count than the banks or the factories, because they died less visibly, one at a time, in towns and cities across the country. A hardware store that had served a neighborhood for 30 years, a dressmaker's shop, a barber shop, a small restaurant run by a family who'd saved for a decade to open it and run it successfully for another decade before the Depression came and took it. These losses mattered in ways that extended beyond the immediate economic damage. A small business is also a social institution. The barber shop is where men talked, where news was exchanged, where the rhythms of the neighborhood were maintained.
The corner store was the place where you could buy one egg because you couldn't afford a dozen, where the owner might extend credit if she knew you and trusted you, where the transaction was also a check-in, a brief acknowledgement of shared existence. When those places closed, something more than an economic unit disappeared. The social fabric of a street or a block or a small town changed in ways that were hard to specify, but easy to feel. The spaces left empty were reminders of what had been there, what was no longer, and they stayed empty for a long time. There's a photograph from a small town in Ohio, taken sometime around 1933, Main Street. Midday from the evidence of the light, and the street is largely empty, not of people entirely, a few figures visible here and there, but of activity. Most of the storefronts have signs in the windows that announce closings or auctions, or simply say nothing. A dog sits in the shadow of an awning that no longer has a business behind it. The street itself looks fine. The buildings are still standing, but the life that was supposed to be inside them is gone. That image, that quality of a place still standing but somehow hollow, became one of the defining visual sensations of the Depression. The infrastructure of prosperity surviving its content, the form of American commerce without its function. Not every part of the country felt the Depression in exactly the same way. Cities had the breadlines and the bank failures and the unemployment offices, but rural America had its own particular version of suffering, and in some areas it was compounded by something that had nothing to do with finance at all. The southern Great Plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, had been farmed aggressively through the boom years, the native grasses ploughed under for wheat fields that stretched to every horizon. It was profitable when grain prices were reasonable and rain was steady. But the soil, once protected by deep-rooted grasses that had held it in place through centuries of wind, was now exposed, vulnerable. When the rains began to fail in the early 1930s, the topsoil dried. And when the winds came and the great rolling plains winds that have always been part of the landscape, they picked up that dry soil and carried it, in amounts that were almost unimaginable. Clouds of dust that turned afternoon into a brownish darkness, that moved across the land like something alive, that seeped through door frames and window gaps and settled on everything inside a house, on the dishes and the food and the sleeping faces of children. People called it the Dust Bowl. The storms came repeatedly. Some of them were enormous, rolling visible from miles away, brown-black walls of dirt that approached slowly and then swallowed the world. The day of April 14th, 1935, a day some called Black Sunday, brought one of the worst of these storms, a wall of dust so large and dark that it terrified people who'd seen storms before. Families packed up. There was nothing to stay for. The land that had seemed so promising a decade earlier was now burying itself. Farms that had been worked for 20 years were simply gone, buried under drifts of soil blown from someone else's ruined field. They headed west, mostly to California, mostly in cars and trucks loaded with everything that could be loaded, the rest left behind in houses that would be buried or simply abandoned. These were the people John Steinbeck would write about in The Grapes of Wrath, which came out in 1939 and captured something essential about this migration, about the particular dignity and heartbreak of people who had done nothing wrong and lost everything anyway. The Okies, they were called, though not all of them were from Oklahoma. The word had the slightly contemptuous quality that names given by outsiders often carry. The people themselves mostly just called themselves families. People looking for work. People trying to find somewhere they could start again. California was not always welcoming. The work that was available was grueling, seasonal, poorly paid, picking crops for large agricultural operations that knew exactly how desperate these people were and set wages accordingly. Living in camps that ranged from barely adequate to genuinely squalid, moving with the harvest, never quite settling, never quite safe, but they kept going, because going was the only direction left. The migration out of the Dust Bowl states was one of the largest internal migrations in American history, a movement of perhaps 300,000 people over the course of the 1930s, most of them heading west with no particular plan beyond the destination. California had been advertised by labor recruiters, by handbills, by stories carried back by earlier travelers, as a place where agricultural work was available, where the climate was gentle, where a person with capable hands and a willingness to work could build something. What they found was more complicated. California's Central Valley in the mid-1930s was already a complex agricultural economy run by large landowners who operated at a scale that required enormous numbers of seasonal workers for planting and harvest. These growers knew the migrants were coming. Some of them had encouraged the recruitment because a large labor surplus meant wages stayed low, and workers stayed desperate enough to accept conditions they might otherwise refuse. The camps the migrants lived in ranged from bad to genuinely dangerous. Private camps run by growers were often little more than fields with inadequate sanitation, where workers paid rent from their minimal wages for the right to sleep in a tent or a converted barn. Children got sick. Medical care was not available or not affordable. The work itself was grueling, picking in intense heat, bent for hours, moving continuously to meet piece rate quotas that rewarded speed over everything. Government camps, built by the Farm Security Administration as part of the New Deal, were meaningfully better. They had running water, sanitation facilities, social workers, and a democratic self-governance structure that gave residents some control over their own community. John Steinbeck visited them while researching The Grapes of Wrath and saw in them something he considered genuinely hopeful. People who'd been stripped of nearly everything, maintaining their dignity, making community rules, holding dances on Friday nights. The dances. This keeps coming up in accounts of the Depression, the way that music and dancing persisted in places where almost everything else had been taken away. Not because people were pretending nothing was wrong, they weren't, but because the need for beauty, for movement, for the specific pleasure of a good song played well and a floor full of people moving together, that need didn't disappear when the money did. If anything, it intensified. The pleasure was cheap and real, and it belonged to whoever showed up. Friday night in a government camp in California's San Joaquin Valley. Families coming out from their shelters in the evening cool. Someone has a fiddle, someone else has a guitar. The dancing is informal, called square dancing mostly, though the forms have blurred over the years of travel and mixture of different regional traditions. Children are running around the edges of the dancing. Old men are sitting and watching. A woman who hasn't laughed in weeks is laughing. For an hour or two, the situation is the same. The wages are the same, the uncertain future is the same. But there is music and there are people and there is this. The photographs that came out of these years, particularly the work done for the Farm Security Administration, which sent photographers to document rural poverty and displacement, constitute one of the most extraordinary bodies of documentary work in American history. Dorothea Lange's migrant mother is perhaps the most famous. A woman, late 30s, 3 children around her, leaning on her hand, looking off into the middle distance. The photograph was taken in 1936 in a pea pickers camp in Nipomo, California. The woman's name was Florence Owens Thompson. She was 32, younger than she looks in the image. She'd driven into the camp following a rumor of work, found that the crop had frozen, and there was no work, and was trying to decide what to do next.
Lang stopped and photographed her. The photograph became famous almost immediately. It ran in newspapers. It became a symbol of the Depression, in a way that political speeches and statistics could never quite achieve. Something about the specific quality of Thompson's expression, not defeated exactly, not appealing for sympathy, but absorbed in a thought she hasn't fully finished, still working something out, struck people as more true than any summary of the Depression could be. Thompson herself, in later years, had complicated feelings about the photograph. It had brought her a kind of fame that had nothing to do with who she was, had reduced her to a symbol of a condition. She was a real person. She'd survived. She'd raised her children. She'd continued to live a life beyond that afternoon in the pea pickers camp, beyond that moment when a stranger pointed a camera at her and caught something she probably didn't know was visible on her face. Walker Evans, Arthur Rothstein, Russell Lee, Ben Shahn. The full roster of Farm Security Administration photographers produced tens of thousands of images over the course of the 1930s. Sharecroppers' cabins in Alabama, miners' families in West Virginia, Dust Bowl farms in Oklahoma, with the dirt built up against the walls like snowdrifts, a gas station in the rain, a family's Sunday clothes hung on a nail behind a door, the accumulated inventory of an American life being barely maintained. What these photographs share, beyond their technical quality, is a particular kind of respect for their subjects. These are not images designed to make you feel superior to the people in them. They're not poverty pornography. They look at people with something that feels like recognition, like the photographer is saying, this person matters, this specific face and this specific life matter, and I am going to try to show you that. Back in the cities, the unemployed developed their own strategies and rituals for getting through. Men, and this was still predominantly a world where men were expected to be the primary breadwinners, which added a particular emotional weight to male unemployment, men would leave the house in the morning, even when they had nowhere specific to go. It was about maintaining the structure of the day, about not sitting in the apartment while everyone else was trying to manage, about preserving some small fiction of normalcy for themselves and their families. They walked. Cities were walked in those years in a way they hadn't been before, not for pleasure, but for the occupation of time and the maintenance of hope that something might turn up. You walked past businesses, looking for signs in windows. You stopped at construction sites to see if anyone was hiring for day work. You talked to other men doing the same thing, traded information. Not here, not there. Maybe try the warehouse district on Thursday. The men who gathered in parks on weekday mornings were an unusual sight. Parks are typically places for weekends and children and leisure. A man sitting on a park bench in the middle of a Tuesday morning in 1932 announced something about his situation without needing to say a word. They knew it. They sat anyway. Card games became common in these gathering places. Checkers, chess, any game that occupied the mind and the hands, that made time pass without requiring money. Some men read. Libraries saw their usage climb dramatically during the Depression. Books were free, libraries were warm, and reading was something you could do for hours without it costing anything. Librarians in cities across the country noted that men who looked like they'd been professional types, who still dressed well enough, who spoke articulately when they asked for recommendations, were coming in every day, reading for hours, and then leaving quietly. Some of them had been coming for months. Children experienced the Depression differently, as children tend to experience most things differently. For many of them, what they remembered later was not the absence of things, but the texture of daily life. The way their mothers managed money with a precision that bordered on art. The meals that were mostly one thing, mostly potatoes, mostly beans, but made interesting by whatever seasoning or technique was available. The way clothing got passed down, and then mended, and then passed down again, until it was more patch than original fabric. They remember gardens. Almost everyone with a scrap of ground was growing something. Window boxes in apartments, lots in vacant spaces. Backyards turned entirely over to vegetables. Keeping a garden was practical. It meant food. But it was also something else. Something about having a small corner of life that was productive and alive and responding to your care. The act of putting seeds in soil and watching something grow was, for people living in a period of profound uncertainty and contraction, something that mattered beyond its yield. Children whose families were better off, there was still a wide range of circumstances, even in hard times, sometimes didn't fully understand what was happening. They knew things were different. They knew their parents talked more quietly sometimes. They knew the neighbor's family had moved away. They knew that the presents at Christmas were smaller, that treats were rarer, that certain things you used to take for granted were just not available anymore. But childhood has its own momentum. School was still school. Friends were still friends. The creek behind the neighborhood was still there. Summer was still summer. There's something in the oral histories collected from people who lived through those years as children, something almost wistful, not for the hardship, but for a quality of life that the hardship inadvertently created. A simplicity, a closeness, a sense that what you had was what mattered, because what you had was all there was. The political world was churning. Herbert Hoover had been president when the crash hit, and he bore the weight of what came after in the public imagination, whether it was entirely his fault or not. His response was shaped by his genuine beliefs. He thought direct federal relief would undermine American character, create dependency, cross a line between what government should and should not do. He believed recovery would come from confidence, from businesses and banks and states managing their own situations, with federal encouragement rather than federal handouts. Those beliefs, reasonable people could have debated in normal times. But these were not normal times. And the sight of the president seeming to wait for natural recovery while millions of Americans went hungry did not sit well. The shanty towns that went up on the edges of cities, clusters of improvised shelters built from whatever could be found, cardboard and corrugated tin, and old wood and canvas, housing families who'd lost their apartments and had nowhere else to go. Those shanty towns got a name. People called them Hoovervilles. It was not a compliment. The name spread across the country with the speed and bitterness of a joke that isn't really a joke. In the summer of 1932, something happened that symbolized the whole political moment as clearly as anything could. A group of World War I veterans, 20,000 of them from across the country marched on Washington. They called themselves the Bonus Army. They were there because Congress had passed legislation in 1924 promising veterans a bonus payment, a form of deferred compensation for their service, scheduled to be paid in 1945. The veterans, many of them broke and desperate in 1932, wanted the bonus paid now. They camped on the mall and across the Anacostia River in conditions that were rough but organized. They had a community, a newspaper, rules of conduct. They were not a mob. They were men who had served the country in the worst possible way a person can be asked to serve, who now found themselves reduced to sleeping in tents on the edge of the national capital, asking for money they'd been promised. What strikes you, looking back at the accounts of that camp, is how ordinary it was. Men cooking over fires, children playing between the makeshift structures, people maintaining whatever dignity the situation allowed. They had been soldiers. They knew how to organize. They knew how to wait. They had waited in far worse places than the banks of the Anacostia River.
Hoover ordered them dispersed. The army, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, with a young major named Dwight Eisenhower among the staff, moved in with cavalry and infantry and tear gas. The camps were burned. Veterans were driven out with force. One of the men in that camp had served in France, had stood in mud for months, had watched friends die, had come home and tried to build something in the years that followed, only to lose it, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left but this, a tent near the Anacostia River and a government that didn't want him there. He left. He went somewhere. History doesn't record where. The image of American soldiers routing American veterans from the nation's capital landed in the public consciousness like something heavy dropped in still water. The ripples spread outward and did not stop. Franklin Roosevelt became president in March of 1933, and the contrast with Hoover, in manner, in communication style, in what he was willing to try, was immediate and impossible to miss. Roosevelt had a quality that is rare in politicians and rarer still in moments of crisis. He was genuinely warm on the radio. His voice carried something that felt like reassurance without condescension, like a person talking to you rather than at you. His fireside chats, radio addresses delivered from the White House, framed as informal conversations, became one of the defining forms of political communication in American history. The first thing he did was close the banks, all of them, for 4 days. This sounds terrifying, and it was a banking holiday, they called it, an administrative euphemism that did some work to soften the reality. But the goal was to stop the panic, to give the government time to assess which banks were sound and which weren't, and to reopen only the sound ones with federal backing that would prevent further runs. It worked. When the banks reopened, people started depositing money rather than withdrawing it. The mere act of confidence, of someone in authority saying, "We've looked at this, we know what we're dealing with, here is what we're doing," changed the psychological atmosphere enough to slow the bleeding. Then came the flood of legislation. The 100 days, they called it, the first 3 months of Roosevelt's first term. Congress passed bill after bill, some carefully considered, some improvised, some of genuinely lasting importance and some that didn't survive legal challenge. The overall shape of what would be called the New Deal began to take form. The New Deal was not one thing. It was many things, sometimes in tension with each other, sometimes contradictory, united mainly by the conviction that the federal government had both the right and the obligation to intervene actively in the lives of its citizens when circumstances required it. Some of what it created was meant to provide immediate relief. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration sent money directly to states to help feed and house people who had nothing. The Civilian Works Administration put 4 million people to work in a matter of weeks, doing whatever needed doing, building roads and schools and post offices and parks, raking leaves if that's what there was, because the immediate goal was the paycheck, the experience of having a job, the maintenance of morale as much as the construction of infrastructure. Some of it was meant to provide work over the longer term. The Public Works Administration built things that still stand: bridges, highways, federal buildings, dams, courthouses, things that required skilled labor and took years to complete. The Works Progress Administration, which would become the Works Projects Administration, put not just construction workers, but artists, writers, musicians, and theatre people to work, paying them to create murals for public buildings and guidebooks to American states, and oral histories of former slaves and performances that brought culture to communities that rarely saw live theatre. The New Deal's relationship with art and documentation was one of its stranger and more beautiful aspects. The government employed photographers to document rural poverty, hired writers to collect the stories of ordinary Americans, commissioned murals for post offices and courthouses all over the country. You can still find them in small towns depicting local history and agricultural life and scenes of work, painted by artists who might otherwise have been standing in bread lines. Some of it was meant to create lasting structural protections. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking, trying to prevent the kind of overlapping risky behavior that had contributed to the crash. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate the stock market in ways it hadn't been regulated before. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, guaranteed bank deposits up to a certain amount, which meant that an ordinary person's savings account was protected even if the bank failed. That last one, perhaps more than anything else in the New Deal, changed the psychological relationship between ordinary Americans and their banks. No more bank runs. No more losing everything because of decisions made in a boardroom you'd never seen by people you'd never met. The money would be there. And that, more than any single program, more than any single piece of legislation, is what people needed most of all. Not money, not food, though those mattered too. What people needed was the feeling that the ground beneath them was solid again, that the basic mechanics of daily life could be trusted, that tomorrow would resemble today in the ways that mattered. The FDIC gave them that. For the price of a few cents per deposit, it gave the country back something that no government program had ever quite been able to guarantee before: the ordinary expectation that your savings would still be there in the morning. Social Security was signed into law in 1935, a program that would collect payroll taxes from workers and employers and use them to provide income for retired workers and their dependents. It was controversial. Some thought it unconstitutional. Some thought it too modest. Some thought it too much. But it passed, and it created something that hadn't existed before. The idea that the federal government had a role in ensuring that people who had worked all their lives would not face utter destitution in old age. None of this fixed everything. It's worth being clear about that. The New Deal did not end the Depression, not in the sense of restoring full employment, of getting the economy back to where it had been. By the mid-1930s, unemployment had fallen from 25% to somewhere around 14%. Still an extraordinarily high number, still representing millions of families in precarious situations. Banks were more stable. There was food for people who would otherwise have gone without. The worst emergency was managed, but the underlying condition persisted. There were setbacks. In 1937, Roosevelt, concerned about deficit spending, pulled back on some programs. The result was a sharp recession within the Depression, sometimes called the Roosevelt Recession, that undid some of the fragile recovery and put people back out of work who had just found their footing. There were critics across the political spectrum. On the right, many businessmen and conservatives argued that the New Deal was expanding government beyond any acceptable limit, that its taxes and regulations were stifling the very investment the economy needed to recover. On the left, people like Huey Long argued that it wasn't doing nearly enough, that the rich should be dramatically taxed to redistribute wealth directly to ordinary Americans, that the New Deal was a half measure that protected the existing power structure. Both critiques contained some truth. The New Deal was imperfect. It excluded or barely addressed the needs of Black Americans, particularly in the South, where many New Deal programs were administered locally, and local administrators often maintained existing racial hierarchies. Agricultural programs that helped white farmers sometimes actively harmed black tenant farmers and sharecroppers who were pushed off land they'd worked for years. This is a significant failure, and not a minor footnote. It shaped the economic trajectory of entire communities for generations.
Women, too, were often treated by New Deal programs as secondary workers. as people whose employment was less important than men's, which reflected the cultural assumptions of the time, but also encoded those assumptions in federal policy in ways that had real consequences. The Depression was, like most large historical events, experienced differently depending on who you were and where you started. Its weight was distributed unequally. But life, even in these years, was not entirely grim. This needs saying, because the totality of the difficulty can sometimes obscure the way people actually lived through it. With humor, with music, with the specific resilience of communities that have always had to make something out of very little. The movies were one of the great escapes of the Depression years, and they were an escape that was accessible in a way that theater or other entertainments were not. A movie ticket cost 15 cents, maybe a quarter for a nicer theater. For 15 cents, you could spend several hours in air conditioning in the summer or heat in the winter, in a world where everything was lush and large and dramatic, and usually resolved well. Hollywood knew exactly what it was selling. The films of the 1930s are sometimes escapist in obvious ways. The lavish musicals, the screwball comedies, the romantic adventures, and sometimes engaged very directly with the Depression, making films about ordinary people struggling and surviving and occasionally triumphing. Frank Capra made film after film about the little guy up against powerful forces, about decency surviving corruption, about the essential goodness of regular Americans. His films were enormously popular, and their popularity tells you something about what people needed. They needed to believe in certain things, that decency mattered, that communities could hold together, that the individual person facing impossible circumstances still had some capacity to act, to make a difference, to matter. Radio stars became the first national celebrities in the modern sense, people known and loved, not just in their city, but across the country, their voices familiar in living rooms everywhere. Jack Benny, Bing Crosby. The comedians whose jokes about hard times were funny because they were true, because everyone listening had lived some version of the joke and needed the permission to laugh at it. Swing music was born, essentially, in the early 1930s, and by mid-decade, it was everywhere. Big band orchestras playing in dance halls and on radio broadcasts. Benny Goodman, Count Basie, Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw. The music was joyful in a way that felt specifically right for the moment, not ignoring the difficulty, but surviving it, dancing over it, refusing to let it have the last word. Dancing was cheap. You could dance in your kitchen. You could go to a hall where the cover was minimal and stay all evening. The music played and people moved, and in the movement there was something that felt, at least for the duration of a song, like things were going to be okay. The years passed, slowly at first, then with slightly more motion. By 1936, the country was still deeply wounded, but beginning to feel some tentative stability. Families that had been getting by on almost nothing had found a kind of rhythm, a way of living within narrow limits that, while painful, was at least sustainable. The generation that grew up in these years was developing qualities that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A deep discomfort with waste, a suspicion of easy credit, a preference for having things paid for and owned outright, a knowledge that comfort could disappear faster than you thought. The habits formed in poverty persisted into prosperity. People who'd stretched food through the Depression stretched it still when they could afford not to. People who'd saved every piece of string and every scrap of usable cloth kept saving long after the need was gone. It wasn't irrational. It was memory. It was the body knowing something the mind preferred to forget. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from being hungry when you're young. Not starving in most cases, though there were children for whom real hunger was a regular experience, but the sustained low-level anxiety of not knowing whether there would be enough. This becomes part of how you understand the world. It shapes what you feel when you open a refrigerator. It shapes what you feel when a bill arrives, or when money is spent on something pleasurable and unnecessary. Children of the Depression grew up and became parents who saved, who kept the pantry stocked beyond what was immediately needed, who felt a specific anxiety at the sight of waste, food left on a plate, a light left on in an empty room, that their own children, raised in easier times, sometimes found puzzling or excessive. It was the body still doing its job, still protecting against a possibility that was no longer imminent, but had once been very real. The schools stayed open through the Depression, mostly, though not without difficulty. Districts ran out of money. Teachers who had been underpaid in good times were paid less, or paid late, or in some rural areas paid in scrip, a kind of local currency issued by school districts that was supposed to be redeemable later, when funds were available. Some teachers went for months without any payment at all and kept teaching anyway, because the children were there and needed to be somewhere, and the work mattered. In Chicago, the schools ran out of operating funds in 1933. Teachers had gone unpaid for months. Some had borrowed against their salaries. Some had given children from poor families lunch out of their own pockets, which meant they had less lunch themselves. A group of teachers marched on the banks that held the school board's debt, demanding their pay. It was not a dramatic confrontation. It was tired people who had worked very hard, demanding that the basic bargain of employment, we work, you pay us, be honored. The children in those classrooms noticed. They noticed everything. The way a teacher looked on a Friday afternoon, when the week had been particularly hard. The way certain children disappeared from class and didn't come back, families having moved in search of something better somewhere else. The way the textbooks got older and the chalk ran low and no one replaced either. Some of what they learned in those years was not in any curriculum. They learned that adult life could be very hard, that the systems adults built to manage the world were not infallible, that the distance between the way things were supposed to work and the way things actually worked was sometimes large, that people managed anyway, that you could manage anyway. This too is a kind of education. The social landscape had changed in ways that would outlast the Depression itself. Union membership was growing, protected now by federal legislation, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, that gave workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. This was a fundamental shift in the power relationship between workers and employers, and it reflected a broader change in how Americans thought about the relationship between individuals and institutions, between ordinary people and the large forces that shaped their lives. The Depression had, in a paradoxical way, strengthened a certain kind of community bond, even as it weakened the economic conditions that made community comfortable. People had learned, through necessity, to depend on each other, to ask for help, to accept help, to see the person in the breadline not as a failure, but as someone who had been caught by something larger than themselves. In the summer of 1939, Europe was sliding toward war. America watched, divided over whether to get involved, shaped by the memory of the last war and the men it had taken and the promises it hadn't kept. The New Deal programs were being wound down in some areas, cut back in others. Roosevelt was navigating between those who wanted more and those who wanted less, trying to hold a coalition together that stretched from Southern conservatives to Northern liberals in ways that required constant, exhausting compromise. And the economy was still not fully recovered. That needs saying plainly. In 1939, unemployment was still around 14%. The fundamental healing that the Depression demanded, the restoration of something like the economic confidence and activity of the late 1920s, had not fully happened. What ended the Depression was not the New Deal alone. What ended it was the war. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the government began spending at levels that dwarfed even the most ambitious New Deal programs. Defense plants operated around the clock. Workers who'd been unemployed for years were needed immediately. Women who'd been kept outside the industrial workforce moved into factories in enormous numbers. The labor shortage became so acute that employers were competing for workers rather than the other way around. Unemployment dropped to nearly nothing. Not because of a natural economic recovery, not because the structural problems had been solved, but because the government had pumped enough money into the economy through defense contracts, through the sheer scale of wartime production, to put essentially everyone to work. The irony is acute. The government spending that many conservatives had argued was dangerous and excessive during the New Deal was embraced and vastly exceeded during the war because no one questioned the necessity. The emergency of war made the spending obvious. The emergency of the Depression had not done the same. The men and women who lived through the Depression came out of it changed. Not in uniform ways, not in simple ways, but changed. They were, as a generation, marked by the experience in ways they carried forward. Their relationship to money was different. Their relationship to government was different. Many of them had watched government step in and do something, had benefited from programs that provided real help, and this created a connection between ordinary people and federal policy that hadn't existed before. The idea that government could and should help people who were struggling, not as charity exactly, but as a basic function of a government that represented everyone, this idea took root in the Depression and grew. Their relationship to community was different. The mutual aid that had sustained people through the hard years, the neighbor sharing food, the church providing meals, the extended family crowding together under one roof, this had made real what was easy to forget in better times, that people need each other. That individual effort is not enough, on its own, to guarantee individual survival. That the social fabric is worth protecting. They were careful with things. This is a small point, but not a trivial one. A generation that had learned to make things last, to fix rather than replace, to use every part and waste nothing, carried those habits into a post-war prosperity that could have encouraged the opposite. Some of those habits faded over time, but they faded slowly.
The churches stayed open. This is worth noting because almost everything else was closing. Banks, businesses, schools in some areas. But the churches stayed, and their role in the social life of the Depression was more practical and immediate than it might sound. This was not primarily a story about theology. It was a story about buildings and kitchens and people who showed up. The church basement in a mid-sized city might have been, in better times, the site of potluck suppers and Sunday school and wedding receptions. By 1932-1933, it was often where food was being distributed, where clothing was collected and given out, where someone could come in the cold and sit for a while without being asked what they needed or required to justify their presence. Pastors and priests and rabbis became, in many communities, de facto social workers, not because they were trained for it, most of them weren't, but because they were the people the community already trusted, the people already embedded in the networks of relationship that made informal help possible. If you knew someone who needed something, and you knew someone who might be able to provide it, the church was often the place where those two facts were connected. African American churches in particular served this role with a depth and organizational sophistication that reflected decades of necessity. Black communities had always had to build their own support systems, their own institutions, their own networks of mutual aid, because the mainstream system had not been built to serve them. The Depression intensified these needs enormously. Black Americans were among the first laid off and the last hired, were excluded from some New Deal programs, faced discrimination in the administration of relief, and the church was often the primary institution holding communities together. The social bonds of religion proved in those years to be something more than sentiment, the habit of gathering, of recognizing obligation to one another, of understanding the community as a unit of shared responsibility rather than just a collection of individuals. This was a practical thing. It fed people. It clothed people. It kept people from being entirely alone with impossible circumstances. Across all denominations and faiths, across different communities and regions, this basic function repeated itself. People came together around a shared understanding that the difficulty was not individual, that suffering was not private shame, and that the appropriate response to someone in need was not judgment but assistance. This is, perhaps, the most quietly revolutionary thing about the Depression. It didn't create these values. They existed before, but it made them visible and necessary in ways that required everyone to look at them directly. The America that emerged from the Depression and the war was not the same country that had entered the 1930s. There was more infrastructure, bridges and roads and dams and public buildings built by New Deal programs. There was a different regulatory structure for banking and securities. There was Social Security. There was a much larger federal government with a much larger role in economic life. There were stronger unions. There was a black middle class that, despite the failures of the New Deal to address racial inequality adequately, had grown through the industrial opportunities of the war years. There was a women's workforce that, though it was pushed back after the war, had demonstrated something about capability that was hard to unsay. And there was, underneath all of it, the memory. The people who'd been children during the Depression grew up to be parents and grandparents who talked about it. Not constantly, not dramatically, but in the particular ways that formative experiences surface, in the way food was never wasted, in the way savings were kept, in the stories that came out around tables at Thanksgiving or during the particular long silences of Sunday afternoons. We didn't have much. This was a phrase used often, in tone that managed to be both matter-of-fact and resonant. Didn't have much, but we got through. Didn't have much, but there was always something. Didn't have much, and we figured it out. The Depression was, in the American memory, both a wound and a kind of credential. Those who lived through it sometimes held it lightly, as evidence that they could survive things, that the worst can be endured, that ordinary people, given no choice, are more resilient than they expect. Let's go back for a moment to that street. The line has moved some. Not dramatically, these things move slowly, but the man with his hands in his pockets is a bit closer to the door. He can see the light inside now. The warmth of it, maybe. The smell of bread is there if the wind is right. He hasn't thought about the stock market. He's thought about his wife, probably. About whether there's enough in the apartment for dinner. About a job he heard about last week that seemed like it might work out, and might not. He's thought about his father, who came to this country with essentially nothing and made something, and what that story means now when he's in this line. He's not a symbol. He's a person. He's cold in the particular way you're cold when you've been standing still for a long time, and the cold has worked its way down into places where cold has no business being, and yet you stand still because moving would mean leaving, and leaving would mean not eating, and so you stand still. The man behind him, the one with the thin jacket, has stopped looking at his shoes. He's looking at the building across the street, at a window on the third floor where a lamp is on, where you can see the shadow of someone moving. Just a shadow, just movement, life going on. There's a child somewhere behind him holding a woman's hand. The child is watching everything with the particular attention of children who've learned that the world right now requires paying attention. Not scared exactly, just watching. The line moves. It moved. Slowly, then a little faster. Not all at once, and not cleanly, and not equally for everyone. But it moved. What the Depression years left behind, besides the art and the legislation, and the infrastructure and the memories, was something harder to name. A knowledge, embedded in the national experience, that the worst could happen. That things assumed to be permanent could disappear. That the distance between security and need was not as vast as it seemed in comfortable times. This knowledge has a way of becoming abstract over the years, of turning from lived experience into history, from history into something still further back, something you read about rather than something you knew someone who knew it. But it was real. All of it was real, the cold mornings, the empty accounts, the breadlines, the dust, the improvised shelters, the stretched flour, the carefully darned socks, the radio voices that came in the evenings and reminded you that you were not alone in whatever room you were sitting in. It was real, and the people who lived it were real. And they were, in the ways that matter most, not so different from anyone listening now. They wanted what most people want, Stability, work, a life that held together, enough food, their children healthy. Tomorrow to look like something they could navigate. They got through, not all of them, and not without cost, but they got through. First Imwe, Umuchinisrida Haritsa. Night is settling over the city. The line is gone now. It formed and moved and dispersed the way lines do. The people who stood in it went back to wherever they came from, to apartments or shared rooms, or in some cases, to sleeping arrangements that required a certain amount of optimism to describe as home. The city is quieter. Not silent, cities are never silent, but the particular noise of daytime has softened into the particular noise of evening, which is smaller and more human. A radio coming through a window somewhere. Laughter from down the hall. A car going past on the wet street, its tires making that particular sound that tires make on wet streets, like something breathing. In the apartment with the weak lamp and the 4 eggs and the bread going stale, and the man who went out again this morning with his good shirt and came home in the afternoon, with nothing but the worn-out hope he carried when he left. In that apartment, they're having dinner now. Whatever it is, they're having it together. The lamp throws its small circle of light. The food isn't much, but they're talking quietly about something, about a thing that happened today, or a memory that surfaced, or a small plan for tomorrow. The child is listening. The man's hands, which spent the day not knowing what to do with themselves, are finally still. Outside the window, the city settles into its nighttime self. The depression is still happening. Tomorrow will still be hard. None of the large problems have been solved by the small warmth in that room. But the room is warm and the people in it are together and the lamp is on. The night is long. It always is. But morning comes back. It always has. It always does.
And that's all for today. I hope you like it. Can you please give me a like and a subscribe? Thank you. See you in the next video.